Hello, everyone. Get my headphones in and get started. Coming to you again from my office at UVI, giving you another video tutorial. Today, we're diving into chapter 1 in the textbook. If you have your textbook, maybe you might want to open it and follow along with me as I go through some of the finer points of chapter 1. Generally, what I do is for each chapter or topic that we are covering, I have created a one-page or two-page kind of summary of the important and key information that comes out of the chapter. Hopefully, you'll find this very helpful in order to understand. I have created the video tutorial for you, so you'll be able to watch the tutorial and follow along with them there. Most everything that I put up on the screen and share with you in my tutorials are from documents that are posted on Brightspace, so you'll be able to look over them as well. Let me get started and share my screen so we can get to today's topic of chapter 1. Right. Okay, I am in Brightspace and I have pulled up a document which is the key focused information in chapter 1. We'll first start off with our standards of critical thinking. Then we'll talk about a very important concept of the frame of reference, and then go into the barriers to critical thinking that are listed in the chapter. But let's go to the chapter itself first. It begins by talking about what critical thinking is, and that's an important thing to answer. By the end of today's tutorial, I hope we'll have a pretty good definition of what critical thinking is. Just like in the last tutorial, we had a good definition of what philosophy is at the end of the tutorial. In the beginning of the chapter, it kind of wants to give us the impression that critical thinking is certainly not about criticizing or anything negative. By critical, we focus on the word critique, meaning analyze, to take apart and really look closely at. There are a number of thought processes going on and brain functioning going on when we engage in critical thinking. Certainly, critical thinking takes time and it takes work. It's an effort, a conscious effort on our part. It's when we decide to take something into consideration in a very specific and clear way. Um, it involves a number of different brain functions, higher and lower order ones. Lower order brain functions are things like memory, where our brain kind of just almost acts like a basic computer doing the things we're asking it to do. Then higher order skills are where we take the data that we surmise during the lower thinking orders and we do something with it. We kind of put it together, put it in order to make sense of it. We'll talk about that a little later when we go over some of the key concepts of critical thinking. But definitely we want to understand that it's both the higher and lower order of brain activity to give us critical thinking. All right, let's start out with the standards of critical thinking to make sure that we actually are engaging in critical thinking and not just ordinary thinking. We want to engage these 8 standards, these things that tell us very clearly that we are doing critical thinking. Um, that's important because we are doing critical thinking to get about the best outcome from thinking. If we are very passive in our thinking process, in other words, the brain is going to act and think whether or not we ask it to or not. You can't not think, right? We're always thinking. But just ordinary thinking is sometimes a passive activity. We don't have to do anything for it to happen. Even when we're asleep, right? Our dreams are a reflection of the fact that our brain is still working and we're thinking. But if we really want something awesome to come out of the thinking process, that's where critical thinking comes in. So we abide by these 8 standards. The first is clarity. When we talk about clarity, we're saying that we are very clear and unclouded in our understanding of what it is that we are focused on, what it is that we are talking about. So if we take, for example, in Spanish, the word claro in Spanish. Claro would be something that you would say in response to the fact that you understand something. And the word claro in Spanish comes from the Latin root for clear and clarity, which is what we're talking about now. So if I said to you in Spanish, this is the case, do you understand it? You say, well, claro, of course. Yes, I understand. So in English, when we're talking about clarity, we're talking about, yes, it is absolutely clear. There is nothing in the way of me understanding the focus of what it is I'm talking about. And that's important because there's always the potential for a lot of possibilities to come into place that can cloud the issue, so to speak, factors and content that really don't necessarily help us in what we're doing, all right, and can take us off track. So we want to make sure that whatever it is that we're giving attention to, we are very clear about it. Okay, a lack of clarity can sometimes come from our own carelessness or laziness to really zoom in on specifically what it is we need to be paying attention to. The next is precision. We have to be very precise, exact, and specific, kind of like right to the point of the nuts and bolts of the issue. A good analogy to understand precision is when somebody says, you hit the nail on the head. When I was young, my brother and I used to always try and help our father when he was doing work around the house. And I remember one particular project of doing the top floor in the house. There were no walls installed or anything like that. So we were putting up the different things to make up the wall. And we always enjoyed using the hammer. So we would have the nails and we would try and bang in whatever my father was holding up. But I do remember a phrase my father would repeat over and over, which reflects how bad my hammering ability was when I was 8 years old. He would say, the head, hit the head of the nail. Yeah, hit the nail in any other part, it's going to bend and it's not going to go in correctly. So hitting the nail on the head is what we're talking about here. Being very precise about exactly what it is that we need to zoom in to make everything unfold as it should. Okay, the importance of precision is very important in certain fields, especially anything in the math or sciences. If you go any one way, wrong one way, one part or the other, you could really end up with an improper or unhelpful outcome. The next is accuracy. We really need to be sure that we have correct and up-to-date information. In today's world, where we get our information from counts. We have to get it from reliable, accurate sources. Fake news is clouding up our ability to be good critical thinkers. So I have to ask myself, can I be sure of this information? Can I really rely on it? Is it the most up-to-date information? In freshman seminar class, students are asked to do some research on their career choice. So I remember reading a couple of years ago a report that a student did on nursing, and she said the starting salary for nursing in the Virgin Islands in the public sector is $22,800. I said, so what? 22,800? That's pretty low. Who's going to want to be a nurse at that starting salary? So at the end of her report, where she listed her references, she said there for that starting salary, she found it in a report from the Department of Labor of the Virgin Islands from 1988. Okay, 1988. Well, the year was 2022. 1988 is not really up to date enough to be very helpful for a report you're doing in 2022. So accurate doesn't always mean as correct as it should be. It also means up to date because information changes quite regularly. What was true one day may not be true tomorrow. The next is relevance. Make sure that we're always sticking to the topic. All right. A lot of times we might bring in other things that don't have anything to do with the topic. For example, if we're talking about something and we find out that this information came from our friend Margaret. We say, oh, Margaret, my gosh, Margaret was on academic suspension last week when she got her grades. She probably is not a very good person to listen to. Okay, well, Margaret's academic status might or might not necessarily have anything to do with what she told us. All right, maybe we're talking about something that has nothing to do with her grades at school. All right, we want to be sure that whatever it is and that we're giving consideration to is relevant to the particular topic. Because if it isn't relevant, it's not helpful. Okay. To try and decide what is the right color to paint our house is the relevant topic we're considering. So if we end up talking about that, a particular paint that was made by a particular company would be the best paint for me to use, but then we find out that that paint is not available in the Virgin Islands, well, that's not a relevant paint to consider then, right? If it's not going to be a paint they're going to be readily able to get, then why even consider it? Okay, so relevant means something that has to do or is helpful or has a play in whatever it is I'm giving consideration to. Consistency. There's always a particular process or way of sorting through something. If I'm doing a paper for English, right? Let's say I have an assignment to do for English class where I have to do a paper and I'm asking myself, well, this composition, how am I going to do it? I can't just simply do it any old way. I have to be sure that I'm doing it a way that is the correct way to do it. There is a right way to do research, right? I have to be sure that when I have documentation to my sources, that it's done the correct format, all right? In science, if I'm doing an experiment, I have to be sure that I'm using the scientific method for experimentation, that I have a control group as well as a group that I'm doing the experiment with. Otherwise, I'm not going to be able to rely on my outcome. If I don't have a reliable way of processing my information, then I'm not going to be able to be confident in what I get as a result. So there has to be consistency. I have to do it the same way every time. Logical correctness just means that whatever conclusion I draw comes from my evidence. I can't come to a conclusion that comes up with something that I don't have the evidence to support. So it has to be logical. It has to make sense. It has to flow from my evidence. If my evidence is this, this, and this, then I have to be sure that whatever that I come to in my conclusion is based on the this, this, and this that I had in my evidence, right? So if my evidence says, for example, the price of ground beef at Pueblo is $6.50 a pound. The price of ground beef at Plaza is $7 a pound. The price for ground beef at Cost You Less is $5.50 a pound. Therefore, I'm going to buy my ground beef from Mini Mart. Well, that doesn't make any sense because you didn't even check the price of ground beef at Mini Mart. Okay, you have to find out a conclusion that you have only considered in your evidence. You can't be drawing conclusions from someplace that the evidence does not support. Okay, completeness. Is my thinking deep and thorough? Have I covered all of the possibilities? All right, I need to be as comprehensive as I can. If my outcome can only be applied to limited circumstances, then it's not as good as an outcome that I can apply to all circumstances. So how complete am I in my thinking? Am I leaving out things? Okay, you know the phrase, leave no stone unturned, right? A lot of times we take shortcuts, all right? We're always looking for the fastest way to get there. We're always looking for the closest spot to the entrance, right? So we have this obsession with being limited in our thoughts to what I need, right? And that's not helpful with critical thinking because sometimes the things I leave out can be very, very helpful. So I need to be sure that I'm as complete and comprehensive as I can be in my thinking, in my approach to what I'm considering. And lastly, fairness. All right. I don't want any biases. I don't want any things coming in that are going to give me a slant in one direction or another. I want to be sure I'm very impartial. I give everything an equal opportunity to be heard because if we go through our thought process with certain biases that, oh, I know this is right anyway, then we may be blinded to things that will give us information to show us that maybe that's not the correct thing or that maybe needs to be considered from another angle, right? So our 8 standards: clarity, precision, accuracy, relevance, consistency, logical correctness, completeness, and fairness. These are our key to being sure that when we engage in critical thinking, we will come up with the most helpful, most useful outcome to our thought process. The next concept we want to explore is a frame of reference. This is going to be something we're going to apply in many different areas of critical thinking. We want to ascertain from which angle or from whose point of view are we hearing the information. In other words, who's telling the story. Imagine for a moment there is an accident, right? And both the people involved in the accident pull over to the side of the road and wait for the police. Now, when the police officer gets there, he's going to want to hear what happened from everybody's point of view. Because in general, when we have an accident, most of us are usually not going to say, it's my fault, I did it, I wasn't paying attention. Most of the time, we're going to say, he hit me or she hit me. Okay, very rarely is anyone saying, I hit them. Okay, most of the time, it's the other person who did it. Now, who's right? Well, that's going to be the police officer to figure out. The police officer is going to go through the stories and they've got to ascertain what is going on from the point of view, from the perspective of this person telling the story. A lot of times people can, you know, not on purpose, all right, by accident, give us particular biases that they might have when they're telling their point of view. Okay, this is going to be especially helpful when we're looking at news and watching movies and television shows or looking at social media and those kinds of things, because all of them might have a particular angle or point of view that they're trying to support or push. So we need to know that. All right. Let's say you ask somebody, who's the best teacher to take for Psych 120, right? Well, maybe a couple of different people tell you who the best teacher is. If somebody says, this is a really great teacher, and you find out they got an A in the class, that's interesting. Very rarely do we get an A and not say a teacher is great, okay? Or somebody says, oh, they were the worst teacher, and you find out that person got a D, right? Very rarely do we get a D and say that the teacher was great, right? It does happen, but not usually that often. So find out a little bit more about what may be behind somebody's point of view, okay? What's their angle? What is it that they're trying to suggest? Now, even though we might have intentions of doing their best at critical thinking, sometimes there are things that just get in the way. There are barriers to critical thinking, and we want to keep them in mind. First off, ignorance and lack of information, meaning I don't necessarily have everything I need to go forward with a good attempt at critical thinking. Sometimes it's from our own ignorance and we've taken shortcuts or not giving and the time and effort needed to really come up with evidence and information. Okay, we may do a Google search and just be interested in the first couple of results and not pay attention to any of the results after that. Sometimes, however, it could be from somebody who's trying to keep us from knowing things, right? Somebody will say, well, I didn't lie, I just didn't say it. So the withholding of information can be a problem. Sometimes it's done without much malicious attempt. Sometimes it's done on purpose, like, for example, censorship. There are governments that don't want us to hear bad things about them. So they might censor the information that the public hears. If I do a Google search here in the Virgin Islands, I will probably get different results than if I do a Google search in Cuba or North Korea, right? So I need to be asking myself, is anyone trying to keep information from me? Because that will affect critical thinking. Then there's the subjective issues of bias, prejudice, and stereotyping. A bias is a slant. Now, theoretically, biases aren't always a problem because I might have a slant or a bias for a particular flavor, let's say, a particular flavor of ice cream. Maybe I say, well, I like strawberry ice cream. I especially like strawberry ice cream that has a little chunks of strawberry in it. Oh, there's nothing wrong with that. It just means that I have to be careful if I'm buying ice cream for somebody else because I might let my bias get in the way of being fair in which ice cream that I'm buying. Prejudice, on the other hand, is a little bit more oppressive. Okay, prejudice is where we are coming to a conclusion based on improper judgments. Okay, for example, I might say, well, um, Larry just doesn't know what he's talking about, so I'm never going to pay attention to anything that he says. All right, so I'm a little prejudiced against Larry's point of view. All right, and that could be a problem because I'm putting Larry in a place where he could never be able to offer me anything that I'm willing to listen to. Stereotyping is where I do something similar, but I'm making a conclusion based on very little or atypical evidence. Okay, I'm putting all of the things that my one experience is associated with into the category of everything related to that category, right? And that's never going to be helpful. So we have to be careful about these three. Okay, they sometimes occur, well, not sometimes, many times occur blindly. So we don't really know that we're acting from bias and prejudice or stereotyping, especially when it's ourselves. Most people who are prejudiced do not believe they're prejudiced. Okay, so we have to be careful in being able to identify them because they can sometimes work in the background. Egocentrism and sociocentrism is about looking through things from my own lens, all right? By being egocentric, I'm saying my way is the best way, all right? It's my way or no way, all right? Since it's coming from my lips, it must be good. It must be helpful. Sociocentrism is when the culture says that, okay? My culture is best, right? A subtle example of that might be if somebody comes to the Virgin Islands and says to you, why do you drive on the wrong side of the road? Well, you're insinuating that the left side of the road is the wrong side. Well, certainly it would be wrong to drive on the right side here, that's for sure. Just as it might be wrong to drive on the left side where somebody else might come from. Right? So it's not about right or wrong, in as much as about what's appropriate for where you are. Conformity to pressure, peer pressure, right? Everybody making us feel like we have to do it this way. Parents, family, friends, fellow students, teachers. Well, you see what it is that human beings have this natural tendency to want to feel like they belong, like they're accepted to a group. And sometimes that means we're willing to compromise ourselves in order to fit in. Fitting in is a nice feeling. Nobody wants to be left out, but we have to be careful about making sure that whatever pressure we're receiving is not undue pressure or inappropriate pressure for us to conform. Okay, this join in because everybody's doing it kind of thing can be a very powerful influence on our minds. So we have to be aware of it, right? Closed or narrow-mindedness, right? Meaning that you don't want to be open to the range of possibilities that could exist, right? This happens quite often in moral issues where people are saying, I abide by these rules only, and anything outside those rules, I cannot entertain. Well, rather than just saying that we're not entertaining them because they're not part of my rules, it might be good to look at each one individually and assess it on its own merits. Conformity to tradition. We've heard sometimes people say, well, that's the way we've always done it. Well, sometimes the way we've always done it is a good way, but it's better to look at the way that we do it rather and whether or not it's helpful in itself, rather than just say it's the thing to do because we've always done it that way. Maybe sometimes it's time to change the way we've always done something. Sometimes maybe not, right? But just to say that it's the right thing to do because it's the way we've always done it, not as good as saying it's the right thing to do because it actually is a helpful, correct thing to do. Blind obedience to authority. Now, certainly authority has its place. No one's saying we shouldn't respect authority, right? If a police officer holds up their hands to tell you to stop, you respect that authority and stop. If the police officer waves you on, you respect that authority to continue going. But suppose the police officer's back is to the intersection and you see a big truck approaching that doesn't look like it's slowing down. Does that mean just because the police officer is waving you on, you should keep going? Probably not if you value your life, okay? So blind obedience is where we give our right to think to somebody else. We turn over our thinking to another individual or another organization or institution. And that's never a good thing. It's always good to be sure that we're thinking through things ourselves, okay? Don't be obedient to anything other than your own rational thought. Even most religions will abide by the fact that an informed conscience is a very important part of our own decision-making process. Okay? Relativism. Relativism is where we say that there are no moral absolutes, meaning where anything is okay as long as I think it. Okay, relativism is a very freeing kind of independent way to look at life, meaning I can think for myself and do whatever I want. But we have to be careful because we don't want to live in an anything goes society. There are some things that we just have to all agree on. For example, the universality of the respect and dignity of human life. Okay, once we start, looking at things any differently, once we stop losing a respect for the importance of human life, we could end up in a very unpleasant situation in society. So there are certain things that we all have to abide by and live by. Everything can't just be whatever, okay, or anything goes. Wishful thinking, that can be very, very damaging, okay? Being too hopeful for things that really don't make sense. Like, for example, saying, I don't have to worry about getting a good job because one day I'm going to win the lottery and that will take care of all my financial needs. It might be nice to win the lottery and have some money, but avoiding work and getting a good education because you think you're going to win it is not necessarily a very helpful way to go through life. All right, like people who say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not going to take an aspirin or a Tylenol. I'm just going to wish away my headache." Well, okay, you can do that, and maybe it might work if you have pretty good power over your mind and mental thoughts, but it might end up with you feeling a little more pain than you need to for a longer period of time. Okay, so wishful thinking is contrary to good logical practices that make sense. Okay. There's a video here that if you have time, I encourage you to go and look at on YouTube, but we're going to move to another document to help us get a sense of an understanding of critical thinking by looking at 4 essential attributes to critical thinking, 4 things that are essential to what goes on in the critical thinking process, okay? So as we said earlier, we're always thinking. We can't not think. Okay, thinking is just the interaction of ideas in our brain. Okay, and as we say, it can suggest a passive activity of our daily lives, which requires minimal effort on our part. But thinking is somewhat like other activities, just like writing, drawing, or fixing cars. Practice and education can make it better. It can improve it. So even though we know how to think already, and our brain's going to do it no matter what, we can improve our thinking by learning about the tools and mental habits that produce the best thinking, which is what this course is really all about. So what are some of these attributes that can help? Well, the first is analysis. Analysis can be said to be the heart of critical thinking. If we're going to do critical thinking well, we need to learn how to analyze. And how do we analyze? Well, it's like taking an approach to ideas from the standpoint of deliberate consideration, meaning you hold an idea at arm's length, examine it, okay, and look at it, try and get an understanding of what it is before you accept it into your mind, right? Um, Now, it's kind of like saying if you don't analyze, you are pretty much just going to accept what you see on the surface. Analysis is going beyond the surface. It's going deep underneath to see what's actually there. All right. We know when we hear about an iceberg, we've heard the phrase the tip of the iceberg. We say a tip of the iceberg because what do we mean? It means that what's visible is just the smallest part of it, just what's floating on the top of the sea. The biggest part of the iceberg is underneath the sea. And if we don't take time to analyze what's there, we're going to be in trouble by missing out the really big part of what something actually is, right? Critical thinking can sometimes be seen as a habit of cautious evaluation, okay? So we have a mindset that uses analysis aimed at discovering the component parts of ideas and concepts, okay? So we're going to see what it is that makes this what it is. What are the pieces that come together to make this thing the thing that I'm looking at, okay? Analysis is the ability to break arguments or claims down into parts to discover the relationships between those parts. This evidence leads to that conclusion. This leads to that, okay? In that manner, arguments can then be evaluated. You can't really evaluate something as good, bad, useful, unuseful, helpful, unhelpful, unless you know exactly what it is. And you can't know what something exactly is unless you analyze it, okay? Good thinkers develop the habit of analysis and take time to think about claims and issues instead of just reacting to them, okay? The difference between reacting and responding is analysis, okay? We react to things that we don't really know very well. We respond to things that we do know very well. Okay, thinkers take claims apart and see what's actually going on beneath the surface. Okay, attention. Well, are you paying attention? Attention is important. The second requirement for good thinking is attention. Simply put, pay attention to the claims that people are making around you. Many, many, many are the deceptions created by a lack of attention, a lazy attitude toward incoming information. Information is bombing at us every moment. Zip, 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 always in front of us. If you use social media, you're getting information thrown at you constantly. If you're watching TV or streaming information, it's always at you, right? You're listening to friends talk, information is coming in. And quite often, people are trying to push a particular point of view or make it seem like something that it isn't, especially in things like advertising, right? So we have to be careful. When we get lazy and let our guards down, things can get in without us realizing. Next, we have awareness. Well, how is awareness different from attention? Attention is being up and ready with all of our thinking ability on target to go. Awareness is our understanding of it. Okay. A third attribute to critical thinking is that of what we call circumspection or awareness. It gives us a wideness of view. It's the ability to look around and encompass the universe of thought rather than remain fixed within the narrow confines of my own perspective. So don't just look at it from my narrow eye view. Rather, look at everything around it. Remember, we looked at those standards of critical thinking when we see complete, be comprehensive. Look at everything. Don't limit myself to just one approach to it. Circumspection means the awareness of multiple approaches to meaning, arguments, and problems, right? So if I'm looking at a desk, maybe I'm in a classroom, I'm looking at a desk. If I only look at the desk from the top, That's all I can know about the desk. I can't know anything else other than what I can see from the top. But if I take the time to look all around the desk, look underneath it, look at the sides, look at the legs, look at the wheels or whatever is holding it up, then I know the desk a little better and I'm able to make some better determinations of it. Is this desk sturdy enough to hold this bag filled with books? All right. If it isn't, then I shouldn't put this heavy bag on there. All right. But the only way I'll know for sure is if I use circumspection, really get a good understanding of what this desk is. How sturdy is it? I have to look all around it to find out that. Why would we do this? Because critical thinking is a recognition of the complexity of intellectual life and ideas. Nothing is ever simple. Nothing is ever what it seems like it is from the surface. Critical thinkers avoid having an oversimplified mindset, and they're able to view opposing viewpoints with interest, sympathy, and understanding. Because the critical thinker knows that until they can fully understand why other intelligent and reasonable people have a different point of view, they can't very well either understand the whole issue or rebut their opponents. How can I tell somebody that their point of view is not correct or not the most helpful if I don't really understand it? I have to understand it first. In order to understand it, I have to know it fully. I have to use circumspection, my awareness to really see all the sides of the issues. Critical thinkers will listen patiently and thoughtfully to the reasons of opponents and consider those reasons carefully. Why are they thinking that way? Right? I think today's political day and age is a great example. You might have known some people who voted in the last election in a particular way that shocks you. Think, well, how could they vote for that person? Right? Say to yourself, what's going on with their mind? How could they do it? Well, we can't just simply discount them as being wrong in their vote. Okay. First, we have to listen to why they claim to vote for the person. Now, if they have a pretty shallow, unhelpful view of why they voted for the person, well, then you could say they just weren't using very good thought in the election when they voted. But sometimes they may have legitimate reasons for voting a particular way. And we won't really know unless we ask them, okay, and listen to them patiently to see why they may have done or said or voted the way they did, okay? Um, Awareness also requires knowledge. We don't get that knowledge unless we listen. It includes the knowledge about what's going on in our society today, right? Knowledge about the various forms of verbal and visual manipulations, okay? Someone may be trying to manipulate us to seeing something or understanding something on purpose, okay? And knowledge about the possibilities of presentation. That's right. All right. One fact can be presented quite truthfully in several different ways, each creating a different impression or meaning. Okay. When my oldest son was about 13, he wanted to go to a party. Okay. And he said to me, Poppy, can I go to the party? I said, well, tell me about the party. He told me, I said, well, it sounds okay. You know, you should go. But I said, of course, you have to ask mommy first. Mommy's the boss. She can overrule me. Okay. So that's the way our house is, the way many married households are. Anyway, he said, well, how should I ask her? And I told him, I said, well, remember, it's all in the presentation. Whether or not we get somebody to see things the way we want them to see will depend on how we present it to them. Okay. So be careful about how you understand the presentation of information. Right. In a nutshell, awareness should include not only knowledge and knowledge of possibility, but the ability to control your assumptions. Don't assume too much knowledge about anything. Socrates always used to say, I don't know anything. He never claimed he knew anything for sure. Yet he was very wise because of that. Okay. Because he always said, I might be wrong. Okay. Always believe that you might be wrong, or the story may have additional elements that you haven't yet uncovered. Okay. There's an old proverb: to assume is to be deceived. Our assumptions can lead us to incorrect conclusions. Many people draw far-reaching conclusions based on tiny facts, all right? That's not very helpful at all. And enormous assumptions are usually wrong. Okay. Let truth and reality unfold without your assumptions and prejudices getting in the way. Now, like I said, that's not always easy because most of the time our assumptions and prejudices are not very visible. They work in the background of our mind, right? Like our biases. And it's hard to recognize them. It's hard to see them. We have to really give some time and effort to going inside of our mind and see exactly why we think a certain way that we think. What has brought us to that conclusion? All right. Only then can we probably identify and outline any assumptions and prejudices or biases that we might have. The critical thinker who uses this attribute of circumspection um, sees things in perspective. Okay. They realize that they could be wrong, that they're fallible. All right. And they admit that the other side may have some good arguments as well. All right. Look for that balance and recognize the complexity of truth. Truth is never simple. There's always a lot of things attached to it. Okay. This is all encompassed in the term circumspection. Finally, we get to the fourth attribute, independent judgment. Right? This final attribute of critical thinking is the ability to form independent judgments based on good evidence, meaning that I'm not going to come to a conclusion loosely. It's going to be something that I can really be sure that I have good reasons to come to a conclusion. This class is about finding and marshaling good arguments. We have to get through an extensive swamp of what? Distortion, manipulation, ploys, half-truths, and fallacies before we can get to the mountain of enlightenment. You have a drum roll whenever we hear that, okay? What's the mountain of enlightenment? That place where we finally say, aha, I understand it. I have the truth. I know what it's all about, okay? Evidence must first be collected. We have to weed and sort through it and find out if it's worthwhile or not, good evidence or not good evidence. And then it has to be put together in something meaningful. This is the process of synthesis. Independent judgment is all about the process of synthesis. And it might be said that to synthesize is to find meaning. So if anything we're going to do in our mind is really going to have significance, going to have weight, if it's going to have meaning, it's going to be because we have sorted through the evidence and made sure that the evidence made sense and come to a logical sounding conclusion. A great analogy for this is Legos. You like Legos? My children used to love Legos when they were very young. They're a big mess, right? You can't play with Legos and not have a mess. Anyway, when you buy the box, there's usually a picture of what you can build with it on the outside of the box. But when you open the box, you don't see the item in the picture. You just see all the different little Lego pieces, right? So you can't just throw the box of Legos on the floor and miraculously expect that item to be built. No, you have to piece things together. You have to take each little Lego and put them together to get to the end result that's going to make sense. The same is true with critical thinking, all right? The information alone is not the answer. We have to sort through it, evaluate it, analyze it, and then piece it together in a way that gives us a good outcome, okay? I might revisit this idea of the Lego analogy again because it's such a good and helpful one, right? When we come to synthesis, finding meaning in what it is that we're talking about. In a word then, critical thinking means not taking the world at face value. No, nothing is ever what it seems on the surface. It means learning to analyze and examine ideas and learning how the manipulators work. Learning how to be cautious and sympathetic to an open range of possibility. Anything might be possible. As is the case with all philosophical work, critical thinking can also be disturbing and uncomfortable. Remember in the allegory of the cave, right? The guy who was going toward the entrance to the cave, right? The light was blinding and it bothered him, okay? It means that we must be willing to examine our own ideas and beliefs to see what rational base, if any, they have, okay? I might think I have all the answers already, but have I really analyzed them to be sure that they make sense? If we have strong views on some popular topic like capital punishment, the environment, justice, theology, we have to be willing to take the risk of examining the grounds for those beliefs and considering opposing views, all right? Why do I believe this? Why do I believe that? What are my reasons? Are they good? Are they legitimate reasons? Sometimes they are, sometimes they may not. But don't worry, have no fear, because in this process, the truth will emerge stronger than ever, and it will gain a serious, thoughtful, intellectual base that will be able to withstand attack or ridicule. And most importantly, the false will be cleaned out of my intellectual baggage. I don't have to worry about that anymore. So, cautious evaluation, circumspection, care and generalizing, independent judgment, these are mentally liberated and more in control of your mind forever. I can't take credit for this page. It comes from Dr. Robert Harris. Okay, and oops, to where I was. Here we go. Right. Now, finally, our working definition of critical thinking. What is critical thinking? This is what it is. Critical thinking is skilled and active. So it's a particular way of doing something in a very active way. All right. I have to get on top of it and do it and exert energy. Interpretation and evaluation. So I'm interpreting the information and evaluating and putting it together to make sense of what? Observations, communications, information, and argumentation. That is what critical thinking is, and that is what we're talking about in this class. Okay. All right. That is our video tutorial for today. Thank you for your attention. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you again next time.